This is the Self-Taught or Not podcast with
Dylan Israel
and Eric Hanchett, where we teach you the do's and don'ts of software development from two software development professionals, one self-taught and one not.
Today, we are talking about testing, which is not necessarily in the quality assurance way, but I'm sure we'll talk about that as well, but more in the developer way of testing.
Yeah, testing is one of those things that we all should do, but I think a lot of us don't. And I've been guilty of that in the past. And it's also one of those things that come up a lot is like when you list stats on things that you should do as a good developer, testing's usually near the top of it. But it's controversial. And we're going to talk about some people who we're going to kind of give a little bit to the other side of why maybe sometimes you shouldn't test. And we're going to talk about maybe what reasons why you should test as well. And then we're going to define some of the tools and things on how to test. And I think Dylan is perfect for this. Dylan is very, very passionate about testing. I think he doesn't make a pull request at his job without tests in. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is 100% correct. There are tests there. And in fact, if someone creates a PR and there are no tests, it is rejected. So it's, which I should say 9 times out of 10. There are those times where you have the tech lead say, Dylan, calm down. I told him we were shipping this today, and it works. Create a technical debt ticket to add test later, or let's this go out. Next PR by the end of the day, we'll do that. So, but yeah, 9 times out of 10, I am super crazy about testing, so much so that my conference talk that I'm doing at DevFest Florida has testing integrated into it as my first official conference.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can't wait to hear more about it. So let's just dive in here and talk about the different types of tests that you might see. And then we'll talk about more about when you should test and what you shouldn't test. So the different type of testing frameworks, there's end-to-end testing, which is really when you're trying to test from pretty much the point the customer gets in the app to the point the customer leaves the app. So it might actually test every single component, every single bit and piece of your application, front end, back end, in one piece. And it's usually from the perspective of the user. So there's tools like Cypress is pretty popular, Selenium, Protractor, things like that will help you with your end-to-end testing.
Yeah, end-to-end testing is quite nice. Now, I would say for my personal opinion is that end-to-end testing is typically when I'm saying testing, I'm talking about unit testing. At least that's where I think the quickest value we can get from testing. My issue with end-to-end testing is not that it's good. It's just that a lot of times it's very fragile, and so it breaks a lot in the sense of when the UI gets refactored. And there's ways that we can get around that. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later.
I think testing in general, if you don't write the right test, can be brittle. We'll talk a little bit about that and how when you're testing implementation details, that can be a little bit more brittle, or depending on what sort of test, how you set up your tests. Like you might be using classes to set up your tests, and then if the classes change, your tests break. So we can talk a little bit more about that. You already alluded to, Dylan, unit tests. That's kind of like the smallest level of tests that you can create. Usually you are almost testing like small little implementation details. Sometimes it's even goes into like individual methods that you expect certain outputs. And you can almost define your unit tests based on what the requirements are.
Yeah, that should be the goal. And a lot of times because I would say testing seems to be something that has gained momentum in the last decade, or maybe really even in the last 5 years as the industry has continued to grow and really come from this sort of much more in a professional sense. Like it used to be where you had one guy that did everything. And at that point, you have one guy who's your network guy, your front end guy, your back end guy, your UAX. He doesn't have time to be your QA guy. And so unit testing in general seems to be the thing that people are getting more comfortable with. And the best way to write your tests is sort of almost to have it mimic acceptance criteria. And then it sort of becomes this self-documentation of what your app's actually supposed to do.
It's so nice to jump in an app and then see that's has a nice suite of tests that work, that aren't just return true, and that it really helps, almost like you said, document the code base, which is cool. Now, by the way, the tools I'm telling you guys today are just really front end focused. I'm not going to go into all the crazy back end unit testing, JUnit, all those different unit testing that you might see on different back ends. But like Jest and Mocha, I think are pretty common in the front end for React and Vue and Angular. Integration testing, I don't have tons of experience in this, but I know there's ways you can create integration tests between different components in your app, like how one component talks to this different API backend and things like that. Have you ever done integration testing?
Not too much. A lot of times it's in the front end for the most part. It's you don't really do too much of it, but a lot of times when I'm doing integration testing, it's really testing configuration. At least in the so making sure that we're hitting the right database, and making sure that we're on the right environment given some scenario. That's sort of been my experience, and a lot of that just seems to be a fancy word for some sort of middleware between a unit test and an end-to-end test.
So those are the main sort of testing keywords that you might be hearing if you just jump into testing for the first time. There's a bunch of others that aren't quite as popular. Like there's behavior-driven development. I know there's some tools where it's almost like your project managers write the requirements down in like human readable format, and then you're really trying to test the behavior of users. I think Cucumber does some of that. There's I know there's like API contract first testing, where you have an API contract that your backend has, and then you write tests against that. But some other common things you might see is this doesn't particularly testing, but there's static types and linters that help you help with your code quality. We'll get into that a little bit more, like TypeScript. There's ESLint, TSLint, Prettier, things like that just overall help out with your code. They're not testing per se, but it can help you catch bugs.
Yeah, and I think we've talked a little bit about some forms of testing, but we haven't really actually talked about why you should test and what sort of the value is. And
let's give that 1 second. Let me just finish up around a couple of these other tools. There's test runners, which help you run all your tests, and usually these are already built into your testing or your framework or library of choice. Like for example, Angular, I think it uses Karma. I think React uses Karma as well. I'm not sure. And then there's assertion libraries that just basically, when you use something called expect, that you expect something to be true or false, or there's this expect library, and it's part of Chai. You can also run tools like test coverage tools that look at every single test in your code base, and it determines your test coverage.
Yeah, and that may actually be one of your deliverables on a project. If you have a project that has said, hey, we expect this to have 80% test coverage, or we can mark it as complete, you might actually, I know on my team that we track that every sprint, where, hey, pull up our code coverage and let's see, did it go up, did it go down, what wasn't covered, what did we add? And so that's one of the items that we do when we give our demo.
Yeah, I've been in organizations like that where we've kept track of that, and I've seen where we haven't. Test coverage too has like different parts. Different test coverage tools, like I've used one called Istanbul. It'll track like your function coverage, and then like every single line coverage. There's like different coverages that you can have.
Branches and statements, and there's sort of like 4 main categories. I forget all of them. One is like, does it hit the line? 2, does it actually go and follow each particular action that could be? One thing about code coverage that's kind of cool is that as you go and you start valuing testing more and more often, you can actually put stuff in your pipelines for when your pull requests get merged. It says, hey, okay, this is at 90% code coverage. If it ever drops below 85, do not merge this PR in. And so it sort of almost puts this check into the system to say, hey, we have agreed that this is a standard and we're going to try and meet that. And now code coverage isn't everything, but it's one of the easier things to say, hey, we're doing something. Whether we're doing that something well, it's a different discussion entirely.
I think coding it's more of a, as long as you do it, it's more of a participation trophy than it is like you made, as long as you participate, you've won. I think just getting people to participate is important, and then that could help with your test coverage. Do you have a percentage on your test coverage that you'd like to see? Because I know some organizations are something like crazy, like 90%, and then some are like, well, maybe 50%, 60%.
Yeah, so if it's up to me, we're talking about 90%. So like in my video dev docs personal project, I think I'm around 85%. So like 80% is acceptable, 90% plus. Now you can't test everything, but you can test almost everything. So that's where the 90% comes. Now I would say in the project that I'm on, it started out with no testing. And so we have been seeing it slowly go up and getting those items, and so we're around 50% right now. But our goal is to be at 80+%.
This is a little bit of a tangent, but would you say how useful are tests after the fact? So if you've written a feature, it's out there in production, and then you go back and then start adding tests to it. I've heard a couple of ways of doing this. Like I've heard of people saying only if you in a code base that doesn't have tests, only go back and add tests if something breaks. And then like if let's say something breaks in one of your features, write the test so that way the test tests something that whatever broke earlier, so that whatever broke won't break again. Then I've heard of other people saying, no, it's okay to go back and add tests to your code that you've already written.
So there's sort of two parts to this answer. One is hey, we have a bug or an edge case we didn't account for. We definitely write a test for that so that we don't go, and because now we'll have some description as to what the issue was. And if there's ever confusion about it, will tell us, hey, we already fixed this or whatnot, and it's something else. So I always write a test for anything, any bug ticket. Secondly, when going into something untested, how I like to go about it is, one, it probably needs to be refactored because every piece of code needs to be refactored at some point in time. So what I would do is I'd go and write tests, which is why it's so important to express it as acceptance criteria. And you don't want to put things like returns an array. It would instead put something like gets drop downs values, something like that, because how it is returned. So you want to, so write more so towards what the user would expect to a degree in the unit testing. And then, so write those tests, and then now you can have the confidence that if you were to go in and refactor this thing so you can make it more maybe faster, you could make it more expressive, make it better, you can go and feel confident that you didn't break anything. And one thing I think a lot of people do when they refactor is they refactor then write tests, but at that point you don't know what you've broken, and you've most of the time a good developer that's not accustomed to testing will just write tests for what their code is doing, not what it should do. And so that's how I would tackle it.
I know definitely having code that has tests in it is much nicer to refactor, because then you can make sure like, oh, I broke this test. And then hopefully the tests are written in such a way that you're not just fixing the test, that you actually saw, oh, I actually broke something and now I can fix it here.
And even if it was like maybe the business criteria changed, at least you know now where you need to change the logic as well, because sometimes things change. I haven't worked with a business today that hasn't changed their mind tomorrow. So it's one of those items where at least you'll know where you broke something some of the time, and you'll know where to fix it or know where to change it even.
I wish there was more time. I think that's the problem there's always this pull between like product and development, where development wants to always go back in and let's fix this code and add more tests, and products like, well, the only reason we would ever go back into that code is if we're adding feature, making changes. So you always have this push and pull of dynamics between product and development.
Which is why I think it's so much up to the developer to have, and this to me, and this might be a kind of a confrontational thing to say and something some people disagree with, but it's up to the professionalism of the developer to maintain the code base. And sometimes that means saying no, and sometimes that means like, that's why I'm a big, although I don't necessarily like test-driven development, I'm a big fan of the idea of it, because in the actual practice of test-driven development, you are writing a test that fails, then you're writing a piece of code, and you're doing this red-green refactor. And the major point to it isn't necessarily that you're doing that, which that's part of it, but it's that you're actually writing tests first so that you have tests, because so many of us will simply write code and then be like, yeah, I'll come back, or let me just do the bare minimum testing so that Dylan doesn't yell at me in a PR, sort of whoever your Dylan is out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. We didn't even touch on test-driven development. We're not going to talk about that too much, but I think Dylan gave a succinct answer. That's where you write your tests first, and that you try to do this red-green refactor where tests, if you whatever IDE you're using or command line interface tool, the tests will show up as red. But then once you fix them, they'll test show up as green, and then you refactor. So it's almost like you start with failing tests. You write your code, then you then the tests pass, and then usually you have to refactor both to make sense. And it's quite a process. I've never done it in practice, though I know some people who are TDD gurus,
Yes,
and they love it.
people who are about TDD are like, they like it like it's religion. And so I'm very pro testing, and I like TDD to a point, but I don't buy into the hype as much. I more so just like make sure your stuff is adequately tested.
Let's just round up the tools. That was a little bit of a tangent, but we have mocks, spies. So those are just kind of tools in your tool belt when you're writing your test to be able to mock out the API. Some of the hardest parts of testing is when you have to talk to an interface or talk to a backend and it has to return certain data. So you have to mock it in a certain way. Or you're faking the data being returned back using spies and things like that. There's also things like Storybook and visual regression testing, where testing's gone to the point where once we have our look and feel, we can make sure that look and feel never changes. So it's almost like taking screenshots of different components in your app and then going back through and seeing if they change. Storybook is more like it's almost like a style documentation tool, but you can use it for testing as well.
And I would say mocks and like mocking in general is one of those items that if you've never done testing, the idea of why mocks exist might be something that sort of fall out of your mind a bit. At least when I'm trying to explain to like junior developers or even senior developers who've never mocked anything a day in their life, well, like the idea that our unit tests in the front end weren't actually hitting an API, you have to repeat that a couple times to be like, well, this is what we're expecting. We're just testing our component. We don't care what the service does. The service, if it works, is going to call this. And then you can create your mock to throw an error when you want. And so that's one of those items that it's very integral to testing, because who doesn't work with an API nowadays? But it might be something that throws you for a loop along the way.
And I've heard some backend teams having to put in tests to different integrations, different endpoints, find it really, really difficult. Like they said, like it's really hard for us to do tests because we don't have the mocks, we don't have the frameworks in place to return back fake data, or we have so many integrations with different classes, like we can't test this one class, or it's really hard.
Yeah,
So
and
front end has a little bit easier, but it can get complicated, especially in Angular. I've had to write some crazy stuff in Angular to do testing. It's not fun.
Yeah, I would say that this is sort of a general thing, doesn't apply to all use cases, but for people who are new to testing, they oftentimes have the mentality of testing line by line, and you oftentimes can't do that. And so one thing I do is I try to explain to people, I was like, imagine this is an abstract class. Imagine that all we know is its name, what it takes in, and what it's supposed to give back. And see if, without you looking at the logic, you can test that it does what it's supposed to do, and go from there. And because once you sort of understand that you're not testing necessarily what's happening in the lines, but sometimes the return statements or whatnot or properties are modified, that it starts maybe making a little bit more sense. But in the front end, again, if you've only ever worked in JavaScript, you have no idea what the hell an abstract class is, which sometimes throws other people for a loop.
That's a good point. So why should you test? I mean, I think we've heard the thing that tests help find bugs. You put more time up front, and then that will help you in the long term in the back. So rather than having your users find your bugs or QA find your bugs, you will actually find the bugs first. It also probably helps with, like we mentioned before, documenting your code, and things just kind of make more sense. What do you think?
Yeah, so the first thing I would sort of argue is that it does take a little bit more time up front, but not as much as people make it out. People who don't do testing will talk about adding tests to their code is going to increase it tenfold. Not really the case. And oftentimes you get a speed increase once you can more confidently go and make a change in the app and not have to do a full regression test on your own. Because that's sort of the benefit that it gives you. If your code is tested, then, hey, I have to make a feature change or I have to edit something, that you have more confidence that you're not going to break something and you don't have to do a full regression test every time something happens. In terms of the benefits of besides that is you get bugs, you should never ever get the same bug again, because now we have a test verifying it says. And in projects where I've worked that they haven't had tests and early on, and I'm trying to get them up and running, but we haven't yet, I've fixed something that another developer has gone and then broke it. And I've had quite literally had to fix a bug 3 times, same bug in a 1-month period, because so many people were just sort of writing over it and all that sort of stuff. So I think in that aspect, you get quite a bit of value, because now we can confidently say that something, and that's not to say that you're not going to have bugs. You can have 100% test coverage on something and still have a bug if your logic's wrong, or there's an edge case that wasn't tested, all that sort of stuff when you handle something. But that to me is the benefit is, one, you don't have to do a full regression test. 2, you can oftentimes go faster because you're not worried about that. And 3, you're not going to be necessarily fixing the same things you already fixed.
Yeah, I've been in code bases where as soon as you start jumping into it, you're like, uh-oh. If I change this one value, will it break the whole app, or will it completely break something? That's always a little scary, and there's no tests, so you don't know if you broke anything.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too where I've worked with developers like, I'm scared to change this code. That should never be the case. Like, you should not be scared to work in your code. We should have some confidence that we're going to do something well and it's going to work. And if there's something that fits through the cracks, it's minor and we can take care of it very quickly.
So let me ask, so have you ever been in an organization that didn't value testing? Like, I've been in organizations that some have loved testing, and then some have been like, well, we have end-to-end tests and automated tests. What do you think about that?
Well, I like all testing. So I think developers in general need to take the mentality that they're the first wave of defense. And sometimes developers have this, like, they just throw it over the wall and forget about it. They don't care if it doesn't build. They don't care if the PR didn't deploy properly. They don't care if what's going on. I got code complete. It's good. And that's a very bad mentality to have. But so I'll say that on my current team, when I showed up, we had about 50 automated tests, or 50 tests, unit tests, and about 40 of them were failing. And so it's a pretty, in this instance, they had said, hey, we got to go fast, and they didn't understand the consequences of it. But from having conversations, and luckily I had a new architect that understands the value of it, from having conversations with the business, I quite literally sent stats to like the senior director who I've talked to twice. And I'm sure he's just thinking I'm paying the ass, but I said, this is why we need to do PRs. This is why we need to do testing. This is why we need to do these things. And if you see here that every bug that we stop going to, like in PRs, for instance, I had to educate about PRs. The reason we do PRs is 1 hour PRs based on, it's some testing group that did this with a bunch of companies in like the early 2000s and late 90s, said that 1 hour PRs stopped 31 hours of dev effort by just doing that. And so testing does something very similar, although I don't remember the stat offhand. So it's an education process like anything else. And I think you have to push for it, because at the end of the day, when you're then working in this code base and you don't feel confident in your own code base anymore because you're so afraid of it, that's on you. And that's sort of the picture I had to paint, is like, 3 months from now, when you come to me and you say, hey, you need this basic feature, I'm going to quote you 6 times how long you think it's going to take, because we don't have any tests and we haven't been able to write code in a succinct fashion where we can raise our confidence to deliver things in a fast fashion.
Code reviews are so important too. I think that's a good point too, bringing up code reviews, and it should be a part of the kind of your testing process. I think, what do you think about, I'm going to take a little tangent here, but we'll come back. So there's definitely code reviews, but there's also manual testing. So some people would argue, well, if I manually test it before I send it over, it'll take an extra maybe half hour to manually test it. But could that be in some situations okay if you're trying to get something out the door?
I mean, I think you should manual test every time. Unit tests are only going to, for the most part, if are only going to test the logic pieces, the pieces that say, hey, if I call this lifecycle hook or I call this method, that it's doing what I think it's doing, assuming that we even tested it properly, right? That's a whole another thing. It's like you may have 100% test coverage just because you hit everything, but maybe your code doesn't do what it wants, or maybe you didn't sync it up with the template if you're working in the front end, or maybe there's something else that's blowing up that has no tests. So I think manual test, like when I pull down a repo and I do a PR, I look through the code, I leave my comments, and then assuming that there's nothing that's going to affect the testing, I run all the tests and then I run the production build to make sure it's all going to build properly, and then I go in to the actual application. I make sure the feature does what it's supposed to do. And the first couple times I've ever done that on a team, a lot of times it doesn't work. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. It doesn't work. But eventually, once you start holding people accountable in this way and with testing and going through it, is they start becoming better developers and caring more because they know that someone else is going to be looking at it. But manual testing is just one, in my eyes anyhow, one additional thing we should already be doing. And unit testing should, like, the manual check should just be like, check. Like, I did it. It worked. Great. The unit test should be like, I was able to feel that confidence that I didn't have to test a million things in the manual check because we have these other tests that's saying every piece of the process worked up to that point.
I've been in organizations where the QA had a reject or approve. So every time they had received a new feature from development, they would do like a 5-minute like sanity check, because development would always throw over code, sometimes that wouldn't even compile or just completely broken because they had not manually tested it before they sent it over. I think they got better at that after a while.
Yeah, and I've been on teams that have done similar things where we're trying to get this sort of this POC to be a real project that doesn't have any testing, and things are broke. Oftentimes, especially with these sanity tests, oftentimes things are broken that people don't even know about. It's not even new code that breaks the stuff. It's that the previous code is so buggy that you just find new things piece by piece as it goes on. And so you just have to say, okay, here are the 5 to 10 things that can never be broken that we need to double check in the code. And if you've gotten to that point where that's something that happens, then you have a very poorly architected app most of the time, or an app that has such low confidence that I wouldn't even say it's the developer's fault, not the current ones, usually the previous ones that sort of hack this thing out, but that your team has such a low confidence in the code that we need to have some fundamental changes, and testing could be one of those to help maybe eliminate the need to do all these manual sanity test checks.
Okay, let's talk about some other reasons why some organizations don't do tests. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to mention a few of them, and I think Dylan will probably make the counterpoint to it. How's that sound?
That they're garbage. That's my counterpoint.
Okay, so I've heard a common. I heard like in the history of front end development, at one point, people didn't do as many tests in the front end, or this is kind of a relatively new thing, and that it's more common to do tests in the back end and not in the front end.
Yeah. So the front end has fundamentally changed in the last decade, where if you were to ask a developer 10 years ago about which side of the coin, the front end or the back end, is more complex, most people would have said in the back end. Nowadays, I'd say it's probably 50-50. There's so much going on in the front end, so much logic. I mean, we're talking about not only responsive design, we're talking about making sure our code's compiled, minified, the functionality of a website is significantly more advanced than it was a decade ago. That the fact that you're just going to say, hey, we didn't do it before and we didn't do it now, we're not talking about the same beast. You don't need tests for your static HTML page. That doesn't do anything. But when every piece of your app nowadays is dynamic and interacts with items from the back end, interacts with pieces of code and state management, that of course you need tests, because it's so much more verbose than it used to be.
I've heard I've heard also points of yeah, testing has just changed so much in the last 10 years that it's a different beast. That's funny. Like, yeah, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you have your little jQuery site with one static page is a lot different than the dynamic React apps that we're creating today, or Angular apps.
Well, yeah, it's like if you look at like my app that I'm working on, which isn't that big of an application, we have around 800 tests, and it should have around 2,400 in my opinion. But we are essentially saying that there is 800 pieces of functionality of this app that we're saying this should do this in this circumstance. There, if you're making a website for a gas station or something that like literally is like, here's my homepage, here's my contact page, and maybe maybe there's an about page. Of course, you might need 20 tests for that. That like, yeah, but most of the time nowadays, as you're working on these larger projects, that businesses, especially on if you're being paid well, want custom functionality, and you need to make sure that that custom functionality works, or else they just go and build a WordPress site.
Another thing I hear is that it's really hard to when you write tests. Tests are hard to write. You can write brittle tests. A lot of developers don't understand how to write really good tests, so they'll break too easily, and it becomes a nuisance for the developers to go in, because they'll try to go in and add a feature. Their tests will break. They just have to go fix the tests, but they're not really understanding what the tests did because they're kind of badly written. Sometimes there's kind of a balance. I think you would agree with this, Dylan, between testing every implementation detail and then testing it, and then just testing the feature itself. So if you are like in your test, you're referring to the exact method and maybe things inside the method. If you do any sort of changes inside that method, it's going to break your test. Although if you kind of abstract it out a layer or two and then you're just testing a feature, like does this checkbox actually work when you press it, rather than does this implementation detail work? It's a kind of a hard balancing act to do, and some teams think that it slows them down.
Yeah, and I would say so the first part of that statement that they're like, oh, well, the tests are hard to do and this and that. I honestly think it's an education process. I think a lot of times people's, oh, well, I didn't have to do tests, or I'm not that familiar with it, and I just kind of did the bare minimum. People haven't necessarily those individuals that fall into that category. A lot of the times, it's they haven't invested the time to learn something new. I mean, a lot of us get comfortable. That's part of it, and the other part of it is that because they haven't had the success with it, like once you've actually been successful with testing, it's very easy to like testing because it makes your job easier. I'm able to go so much faster because I have testing that I don't have to worry about breaking other parts of the application or what I'm working on, or it does exactly what it's supposed to do. As I'm continuing to, and I write tests as I'm doing my new features. So it's not just like old stuff that you're breaking. You can write tests as you sort of hit these mini milestones in your ticket. But once you start getting some success with it, it's like going to the gym, right? You're out of shape. All of a sudden, you got six-pack abs. You're getting a little bit more attention from the ladies or the guys, and whatever your deal is. And you're like, hey, this whole like working out thing sucked, but it's feeling kind of good because maybe my ass isn't going to be single for the next decade. So it's sort of like that. Once you start seeing some of the benefits of the hard work and sort of the education and the actual implementation of these things, I think most people start appreciating them a little bit more.
And C. Dodds is big in the React community. Yeah, he wrote the React test utils, and he's also done tons of conference talks about testing. One thing he always says is that in the React community, they've gone through a shift in the last couple of years where they've gone from this kind of class-based writing style of their components to this hook space. And he said a lot of teams have been moving that over, but the problem is they've written such poor tests that they're having a hard time doing it because they've had to rewrite all their tests. And he was talking a lot about, this was at React Rally, you guys can look it up on YouTube, how if you kind of abstract away a little bit of the way you do tests, it's not going to be as hard because once you see the benefit of doing tests and you write them in certain ways, it makes refactors and things like that a lot easier. One thing I hear all the time is that we can't write tests because we have deadlines. There's not enough time. We're go. Testing is going to add another, day to the ticket, and we can't do it.
Yeah. So my argument to that is That's unfortunate because I write tests first. So like, and that's sort of back to the TDD thing. Well, the way that I write code is with testing, and that's how I know that it works and all that sort of stuff. So it sort of always comes back to the developer, because here's the thing, and why so many project managers and scrum masters sometimes get annoyed with me is when they when they come with me with these deadlines, my response is, who's gonna die? Is Steve gonna die? Steve's not gonna die. Is Mary gonna die? Mary ain't gonna die. Okay, I guess I'm gonna write some tests, because it's like, no, deadlines are a 99% of the time a fictional thing. They are something that are there because planning was poorly done. There's something that is there because somebody wants something. They it's almost as it's a fear tactic. This is my honest opinion about 99% of deadlines. It's a fear tactic to try and get devs to work faster. And if you really give it, and this is sort of going off in a separate direction more than testing, but if you give in to these deadlines, you're going to be one of those developers that, like, the average developer is at a job 18 months. I just saw a stat the other day for 2019 about mental health. 55% of tech workers, which is almost twice as high as other industries, attribute their bad mental health to their work environment. So you have to sort of, deadlines would be one of the number one things at the top of that, an unrealistic request saying like, hey, sorry, but it's just not going to be ready. And you sort of have to have that level of professionalism to a degree to say, hey, we need testing in here. You may not understand, but I understand. I will be the parent in this and say, I know what's best for the project and for the development. You may not understand the value of testing, and we're going to work on that, but you still have to implement.
I don't think I could ever tell my project manager, what, is someone going to die if we don't hit this deadline? I don't know if I could do that.
I'm telling you, man, it's not an easy thing to do, but like, you try and so here's a funny thing. So at my current job, about 3 weeks in, they were getting upset because one of the people are getting upset about us slowing things down because we were trying to deliver these features. It's like, hey, slow down, we're doing PRs, we're doing testing, all that sort of stuff, and she got upset and called me into a meeting and was like, who's going to tell, so-and-so senior director? I was like, I'll do it. Like, that apparently wasn't the answer she was going to look for about this being delayed. But it's true. I have no problem explaining to so-and-so that's 7 levels above me why this isn't getting delivered, because I'll give him an honest answer about why. And, sometimes if you just tell them, like, listen, it's going to be shit. It ain't going to work. We're going to hot fix it, and it's going to be more work in the line. Or give me a week, it'll do what it needs to do. And like, so it's hard to have those conversations without a doubt. But I do think that at the end of the day, as a professional, you get a little bit more respect. When you give your estimates, they're respected more because you have a bit of a background of saying, look, Dylan has said all this is bullshit, but when he says it's not, it's going to get done, and it's going to work, and we're not going to fix it for the next 3 sprints.
It kind of goes back to our Agile episode where development should be the one driving the estimates, not management. And then also those estimates should dictate the deadlines. And then there should be a little bit of leeway on there, because if you're in a sprint-based platform, sprint-based Agile workflow, those estimations are not going to always be correct, and it's going to take time for the team to really estimate correctly. But if you're in an organization that's like, go, we have to get this done by this date, then it's bad for the mental health of the developers, because I think we've all done this. We've gone through those sprints where we've worked our asses off to make the deadline. That's okay to do every once in a while, but if that is every single sprint, then you are going to start pulling your hair out after a while.
The reason they call it Death March is because people die, like, on the inside, and that's why they move on to other jobs. And so, like, I have a sort of a 3-strike rule, where if that happens 3 times in a year, I'm gone. That's it. Mm-hmm. I'm applying for other jobs, and then you lose like about a strike a year. So like, you can kind of do like 1 sort of death march to 2 death marches a year, and then it's time to move on. Because once you start going past more than 3 unrealistic things, we're now in a quarterly thing where you can't get projects in 6 sprints. You can't handle estimations and projects, and instead of developers giving feedback for how long things, you're just getting told how to do something. And I'm a goddamn professional, all right? Like, I will tell you what something's going to take and how to build it and how to make sure it's reusable, and we can do all that. And if I tell you 6 weeks and you tell me one, it's not like it's not a negotiation. Like, we're all on the same team. I'm trying to get you what you want because that pays the bills, but it still takes 6 weeks. Like,
Yeah, exactly. So another thing I've always commonly heard, and we'll wrap it up here, TypeScript linting is good enough because TypeScript kind of added this way of catching a lot of different bugs before you even commit the code.
I mean, the only bugs it checks is type errors, and that's assuming that your functions are doing what they need to do.
You can also write TypeScript in a way where you use the any keyword everywhere.
Yeah.
And you're not really using types at all, and then it just doesn't.
It's just JavaScript.
Yeah. Then at that point, you lose a lot of the functionality of TypeScript if you don't use types. I've done that before when I've quickly had to, I guess the kind of idiomatic way you should use TypeScript. Let's say you have a backend response coming back. You should probably create an interface or a class for that, whatever is being returned, so you know exactly every single input that's or output that's coming back from the back end, and then you could easily reference that inside your code. But sometimes I'm like, I'll just put any here, and just like I know it's going to be dot ID here and dot something else. Then I guess that's pretty much it. I mean, sure, if you guys are listening right now, you probably think of a few others. Maybe if the code base is really simple, you may not need tests. Maybe that might be the argument. If you're creating like a quick prototype, a lot of times management's like, we need to get this out tomorrow. Can you just like create a quick prototype? I mean, that kind of goes back to the deadlines. You might like, well, maybe I can't put tests in. And then I've heard a lot of organizations that they say, well, we have a QA organization that's really good, that they're going to find all the bugs. And there's now, you might have this in your organization, Dylan. We have test automation engineers, and we also have like basically people that all they do is just work on test automation. So that way all the tests get run in your CI/CD pipeline, but you can actually run, these QA organizations have their own tools to create end-to-end tests. I think like QA Tester is one of them. There's a few of them, and you can actually integrate that into their CI/CD pipeline. So there's like a whole, if your QA department is sophisticated enough in doing all this automated testing and they have their own automation test tools, there's sometimes an argument that, well, we don't need to have the developers write their own unit tests as well.
Yeah, no, they're wrong.
And it's an evolving landscape there. I think that's all I got. We kind of touched a little bit at the end about automated testing, but I think that's becoming a bigger and bigger thing of how can we make sure all the tests that the developers write, all the tests that QA writes, is put into a pipeline that every single build that they get run, and if they don't pass, then the build doesn't go out.
Yeah, if it was up to me, QA would do manual testing. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them doing the automated testing, but oftentimes when the automated testing breaks, the devs have to fix it anyhow. So like I personally I would say more often devs are just doing unit testing and someone else is doing the automated testing. But like I would like, if I was a tech lead, I would actually have the automated test be part of the repo, so you would run them as a dev, and each one of those PRs we would know ahead of time if we broke the automated test, and you just go and fix whatever selector changed, or you refactored some code and you update the automated test like you would do unit testing.
Oh yeah, when their automated testing breaks on the QA department, that's not fun. Sometimes they go back and fix it, and then sometimes they're like, hey, why did you change this? That broke our automated tests. I've heard also if your QA developers are just really good, they're going to be able to find most of the tests. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Yeah, I think that's all I have. Do you have anything else to add, Dylan, today?
Just do your testing, people. I'm sick of coming on to projects with no testing.
Exactly. Yeah, make sure you do your tests, and just keep learning. I think I've been in organizations where they don't value testing, but I still do testing anyways. And
I won't enter. So if a company doesn't do testing at all, like not that they do testing bad or they don't do it a little, but they don't do it at all, I won't even interview with them. I got interviewed at a bank. They didn't do any testing. You holding people's money. Come on, man. That I can't do it. We're just it ain't gonna work.
Sure. Yep.
I will leave it at that. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to find more about what I'm up to, go to dylanisrael.com.
And if you want to know what I'm up to, you can check out my website at eric.video. If you haven't already, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And if you do, you might even be featured on our next episode. Don't forget to check out the website at selftaughtornot.com. From there, you can sign up for a mailing list where we give away free courses and a bunch of cool stuff. And we'll also let you know when the next episode comes out. And finally, if you didn't know, we have a Facebook group. It's called Code, Tech, and Caffeine. We have over 10,000 members. And you can find the link at selftaughtornot.com. So come join us. We have tons of developers willing to help you guys, mentor you guys. Check it out. Just make sure you go to selftaughtornot.com and check out the Code, Tech, and Caffeine link. Thanks, and take care.